Hey y'all! It's entry number 80 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Elijah Mitchell, running back, San Francisco 49ers. We'll start with the positives with Elijah Mitchell's fantasy profile. Bell cow in 2021. It was partially due to injuries to the running back room, but Elijah Mitchell got a ton of work last year, averaging 20.5 touches per game according to Pro Football Reference. He's just one of 6 active running backs to average 100 or more scrimmage yards per game over the course of their career, with a minimum of 10 games. The other players being Christian McCaffrey with 113.8 scrimmage yards per game in 58 games, Jonathan Taylor with 113.7 scrimmage yards per game in 32 games, Dalvin Cook with 112.8 scrimmage yards per game in 56 games, Ezekiel Elliott with 109.4 scrimmage yards per game in 88 games, Alvin Kamara with 102.8 scrimmage yards per game in 73 games, and then Elijah Mitchell with 100 scrimmage yards per game in 11 games. This is fantastic company for Mitchell to be in, and show that he could possibly be undervalued at his current ADP. The next thing I really like about Elijah Mitchell's fantasy profile is his week-to-week consistency. In half PPR formats for the 2021 season, Elijah Mitchell had 0 out of 11 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 11 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 11 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 11 games with 15 to 19.9 fantasy points, 1 out of 11 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 11 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Scoring at least 5 points in every game and having 15 or more fantasy points in over half of his games is very impressive for a guy that was a rookie last year. The third thing I really like about Elijah Mitchell's fantasy profile is his rushing yards after contact. In 2021, Elijah Mitchell had 515 rushing yards after contact, the 5th most in the NFL, and averaged 2.5 rushing yards after contact per attempt, the 5th best mark in the NFL according to Pro Football Reference. Being so good in the yards after contact department should make it easier for Elijah Mitchell to see consistent touches and get fantasy points. Moving on to some of the concerns with Elijah Mitchell's fantasy profile. Competition. The San Francisco 49ers drafted Tyrion Davis-Price in the 3rd round of the 2022 NFL Draft. In addition, the team still has Jeff Wilson and Trey Sermon around. Given head coach Kyle Shanahan has flip-flopped between a running back by committee approach and a bell cow approach on the ground over the course of his career, there's a chance that Mitchell is not a bell cow in 2022, especially with his injury history. The next major concern I have with Elijah Mitchell's fantasy profile is the fact that the Niners are making a quarterback change this season. The San Francisco 49ers will be going from Jimmy Garoppolo, starting at quarterback, to Trey Lance. These two quarterbacks are completely different stylistically, with Lance being more in the mold of a physical freak archetype of quarterback, the Josh Allen style, whereas Jimmy Garoppolo was more of your traditional pocket passer with little rushing ability. Because of this big change, we have to wonder 2 things. Will the Niners offense be as good as last year? And how much rushing usage will Trey Lance get, particularly in the red zone? There's a lot of uncertainty here with the QB change, and it could impact Eli Mitchell's fantasy profile. The third major concern I have with Eli Mitchell's fantasy profile is the offensive line changes. The San Francisco 49ers offensive line was the 3rd best in the league last year according to Pro Football Focus. But it's a new year, and the line has drastically changed from 2021, with the team only bringing back 2 of their 5 primary starters from 2021. Now, going into the 2022 season, the team's offensive line is projected to rank 14th according to Pro Football Focus. A worse offensive line will make it more difficult for Mitchell to be successful in 2022. Some additional thoughts on Eli Mitchell's fantasy profile. In 2021, Elijah Mitchell finished as the RB24 in standard, with 146.0 total fantasy points and 13.3 fantasy points per game. The RB25 in half PPR formats with 155.5 total fantasy points and 14.1 fantasy points per game, and the RB26 in full PPR formats, with 165.0 total fantasy points and 15 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Eli Mitchell may have only caught 19 passes, but he did so on just 20 targets in 2021, posting a fantastic catch rate of 95%. Coaching. As a whole, Kyle Shanahan's running back room has had slightly above fantasy production relative to other play callers, even with him providing slightly below average usage to his backs in the passing game. Broken tackle percentage. Elijah Mitchell had a more mediocre 13.5% broken tackle percentage according to RotoWire. Injuries and build. Just in the 2021 season, Elijah Mitchell had a shoulder injury, a rib injury, a finger fracture, a concussion, and a knee patella sprain, according to Draft Sharks. In addition, so far this offseason, Elijah Mitchell has a hamstring injury. These tend to linger, so keep an eye on any updates here. Personal opinion. Elijah Mitchell is going off the board as RB23 about pick 67 overall on ESPN and RB20 about pick 42 overall on Yahoo. Going into this write-up, I was not particularly high on Elijah Mitchell, and he was a guy I consistently bumped down the ranks in favor of other running backs. Now, after doing more research, I think he's undervalued a little bit at his current ADP, especially on ESPN. Averaging 100 scrimmage yards per game over the course of a single season is not something that many active backs have accomplished in their careers, and Mitchell has already done that in just his first season. Prior to his hamstring injury announcement, I put him in the RB14 to RB18 range of my own rankings, and if he gets a good injury update, I will be targeting him in fantasy drafts at his current ADP. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. I couldn't find a link to a cause that Elijah Mitchell supports, so here's a link to his teammate, George Kittle's My Cause My Cleats in the past. Kittle has built a strong relationship with the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, after first being introduced to them after the 2018 Pro Bowl. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.